Welcome to our second lecture on the origin of species. I ended the previous lecture with the remark that Darwin changes everything. Or to put it in his own more tempered mid-Victorian language, when the views advanced by me in this volume and by Mr. Wallace, or when analogous views on the origin of species are generally admitted, we can dimly foresee that there will be a considerable revolution in natural history. A truly great understatement. And as Darwin himself points out, later in that same paragraph on page 503, the most important such change is in systematics, the branch of natural history concerned with identifying and classifying organisms, identifying them as, say, Homo sapiens, or Canis domesticus for the domestic dog. What species, genus, family, etc. do they belong to? Now, before Darwin, natural historians in general, and systematists in particular, or taxonomists, as they're now sometimes called, focused on types. The goal was to see through the individual organisms in front of you and to identify them as members of a particular kind, as having been produced by the particular kind of animal, right? When do I have a new species? When do I not have a new species, right? That's the big question for pre-Darwinian systematics, because the goal is to figure out what are the species, what's the structure of the natural world. Think of it again as the question, right? How many species are there is like asking how many chemical elements are there on the periodic table. Whereas after Darwin, right, we have to shift. We have to stop looking for the species and start looking at the organisms, right? There are populations of organisms, groups of organisms, connected via resemblance, a tendency to interbreed, and geographical relationships. But that is basically almost accidental in the Darwinian worldview, right? It's a way of organizing our experience of the natural world. It's not an explanation of it. All right. So before Darwin, right, the idea was that biology was concerned with teleology, with purpose and function. And I could explain why dolphins have the shape that they do, and why they have the physiology that they do, and why they are the way that they are, by an appeal to the need of animals like dolphins to live in a particular environment. They have to serve a particular function, and so they need particular features. Whereas afterwards, right, today, right, that doesn't serve as much of an explanation. If I ask, why do dolphins have flippers? And the answer can't just be because that's the way dolphins are, or that's the way dolphins need to be in order to be able to swim in the ocean, right? Need to be able to explain what process leads to the existence of mammals that swim in the ocean and have these features. All right. So it becomes an historical, in the modern literal sense of explaining how the past produces the present. And ultimately then we get to most controversial aspect of evolution, which is that before Darwin, it was generally believed that some act of special creation took place. That is, the various species that exist on Earth are the product of some kind of interventionist, intelligent designer, some intention. So each species of animal is designed or intended to live in a particular environment. And in order to live in that environment, it is given particular features by that intelligent interventionist creator. And of course, that's what we don't have once we move to Darwin. Darwin says, no, no, no. Even if there's an intelligent creator, and Darwin is essentially neutral on this question, right? Because he rightly, I think, recognizes it just doesn't matter. But if there is an intelligent creative designer, an intelligent creator, then that creator works by creating one or a few background forms and then allowing them to reproduce, vary, and develop into the world that we see around us today. So how does Darwin get here? Well, he gets here, right? He inherits a crisis in natural history. Roughly speaking, natural history in the first half of the 19th century and before means something like the combination of biology, ecology, and geology. And the most important crisis, the most important aspect of this crisis is the recognition that the world is much, 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 much unimaginably more old than it had previously been understood to be. And the crucial thing here is not just that it's temporally old, that is, that the clocks have been running for a long time. The crucial thing is that it's developmentally old. Right? The Greek philosophers like Aristotle believed that the world had existed eternally. But they believed that the world had existed eternally in basically the form that they saw it around them in their own time. So the world was the way that it is. Even if it had been sort of running for a long time, it hadn't been changing, developing, or growing in any sense. By the time that Darwin is making his major contributions, it's now clear that the world of the past is a radically different place, and that most importantly, humans are latecomers, right? The world was around for a very long time before there were human beings to pay attention to it. And that then connects to a collection of debates in geology. So the question then becomes, well, how does the world change? What is the source of that change? And that's the product of looking at all kinds of new spaces, both things like islands, island formation, volcanoes, but also, for example, the ability to delve much, much deeper in the earth, to dig much deeper mines, and to see what's down very deep in the earth, as well as what's a long ways away horizontally. And then finally, there are a collection of problems in anatomy and physiology that Darwin needs to resolve. So let's take a look at these in order. So deep time, as I'm calling it, right? there are two names that are probably most important for this transformation in our view of the world. Georges Cuvier, who is the discoverer of extinction, right? He's the first person to recognize clearly that most of the plants and animals that existed a long time ago no longer exist in the present. That the past is a very different place. And he recognizes this in large part because he's the first to really grasp the idea that these weird rocks that kind of look like living things are in fact the transformed remains of living things. And that therefore, right, it's not an accident that we find fossils that resemble each other gathered in the same layers as we dig down through the earth, right? So it's really Cuvier who's the first to recognize that by digging down, I'm really getting to look at the past. And then the other is Richard Owen. Owen was first a collaborator and then an opponent of Darwin's. He helped Darwin catalog his specimens from the Beagle voyages, but then was a vociferous opponent of the theory of evolution. But he was a brilliant comparative anatomist, considered the founder of paleontology, if only because he is the guy who named dinosaurs, right? Dinosauria is his name for these ancient large lizards, or whatever they are, that we find in the fossil record. And he's the first to give us anything that looks like this sort of breakdown of the past into eras based on what kinds of organisms live in that period. So how then does this transformation work? Well, obviously, if this is right, the sort of popular religious young earth idea that we can sort of look at human history and that written history, whether in the Bible or just history, is the history of the earth, is not going to do us any good. So Cuvier first begins by suggesting what he calls catastrophism. What Cuvier does is take this idea that we see in lots of religious traditions around the globe. The most well-known to you folks is probably the flood narrative of the Bible, but similar ones elsewhere. That basically says every once in a while the world just sort of reboots itself and restarts in a radically new form. And he just extends that and says that this has happened not once, but many times. And that's how you explain extinction. That's how you explain the different layers in the geological record, and so forth. Later, right, we get Robert Lyell, who is a teacher, friend, and collaborator of Darwin's. In fact, Darwin brings Lyell's book, The Principles of Physical Geology, with him on the Beagle and makes serious contributions to this debate based on what he sees on that voyage. And this gives us our sort of modern picture, right? That, excuse me, the surface of the earth is sort of floating on top of a kind of constantly flowing, changing, bending, twisting, right, surface. And it's very, right, it's all slow, right? We now talk about geological timescales, right? So we don't really see it happening in this because it just takes too long. But everything is always happening, right? Mountains don't pop up, right? That's what Cuvier would say, that over a relatively short period of time, right, old mountains go away and new mountains show up, right? No. Mountains we see around us are constantly either being added to or worn down, right? Uniformitarianism. And this is crucial. This insight of Lyell's is crucial in part because Darwin sees his own account of biological evolution as an extension of Lyell's uniformitarianism from the inanimate to the animate worlds. However, any theory of evolution needs to deal with some puzzles or some problems in biology. And the crucial bit here is this problem of the correlation of parts, right? Cuvier, again, he's the most important natural historian of the first part of the 1900s, 1800s, 19th century. And as Cuvier points out in this quote, right, you can often reconstruct an entire organism from one bit. If I give you one bone from a dinosaur, a good paleontologist like Cuvier or Owen can reconstruct almost the entire skeleton, right? If I know one part of the metabolic cycle of an animal, I can tell you its whole life cycle. So everything fits together in this very, very fine-grained way, and not just within the organism, but in terms of the way the organism fits into its environment. So not only can I reconstruct the entire organism from a very small sample of the organism, I can often tell you what environment the organism lived in from that same small sample. But here's where things get puzzling. It's still done based on a very small number of sort of plans, right? These are called homologies, or same or similar structure. Homo, same, logos, structure, homology, right? So take a look here, right? The forelimbs of 6 different animals, right? So start by looking at the human hand. And then notice that the bat, the bird, the horse, the dolphin, and the turtle can all be seen as variations on the theme of a hand. Or if you like, that, right, the hand is a variation on the theme of a dolphin's flipper, right? No one of them is more basic than the other, but they're all variations on some shared plan. So you've got this immense variable fine-tuning, but all based just on one or a small number of structures, right? And so Darwin and Wallace, right, have to solve this problem. How can you explain the extreme variation in the distribution of organisms, both temporally in time and geographically in space, while also accounting for the fine-tuning of those organisms to the environment in which they occur, and of the parts of those organisms to the organisms as a whole? That's what we will pick up in 2 lectures. Our next lecture is going to be on Darwin and what he brings to the solution of this problem.